Chapter 1. The Tragic Start. In the heart of the White Tiger Reserve, nestled within the dense forests of South Asia, a miracle was quietly unfolding. The reserve, a sanctuary for endangered species, was home to several Bengal tigers, whose majestic beauty and fierce presence attracted visitors from around the world. But it wasn't one of the wild creatures that would soon capture attention. It was the incredible bond that would form between a German shepherd and two abandoned tiger cubs. The story began on the morning of September 18th, when Sirona, a young tigress, gave birth to two cubs, one male and one female. The birth should have been a moment of celebration. However, for Sirona, it marked the beginning of an unexpected and tragic journey. Sirona, a tigress who had been rescued from the wild just months earlier, was still fragile and unwell from a life-threatening disease that had nearly taken her life. She was brought into the reserve under the care of dedicated staff, but her trauma ran deep. The sickness had left Sirona weak, physically and emotionally. And so, when the time came to give birth, it was clear that Sirona was not prepared for motherhood. She gave birth in the early hours of the morning, but it was evident from the beginning that something was terribly wrong. While the cubs were born healthy, they were quickly abandoned by their mother. Sirona, confused and exhausted, didn't show the maternal instincts that a mother tiger should. She kept a distance from her newborns, watching them with wary eyes but never approaching them. The cubs, still wet from birth, lay helplessly on the cold floor of their enclosure, their tiny bodies trembling with the shock of the world. Their cries echoed in the empty air, but Sirona remained unmoved, not even offering a comforting lick or nudge. The reserve staff, who had been monitoring Sirona carefully throughout her pregnancy, were initially hopeful. They knew that many animals, particularly those who were young or first-time mothers, could take time to bond with their cubs. But as the hours turned into days, it became clear that Sirona's maternal instincts weren't emerging. The cubs cried for nourishment and warmth, yet their mother would not respond. For 3 long days, the staff watched with growing concern. They tried everything they could think of, playing soothing sounds near Sirona, bringing her closer to the cubs, gently urging her to care for them, but nothing seemed to help. Sirona refused to go near her offspring. Her body was weakened from her illness, and her mind was clouded with uncertainty. In the wild, the instinct to care for one's cubs was primal, but for Sirona, the trauma of her past had shut that instinct off completely. On the 4th day, the staff made the difficult decision to intervene. They had tried their best to allow nature to take its course, but the situation was now critical. Without the nourishment and care of their mother, the cubs were beginning to suffer. The male cub, larger and stronger than his sister, was beginning to show signs of weakness, his breathing shallow and labored. His sister, smaller and more fragile, was in even worse shape. Her fur was dull, and her tiny body was cold to the touch. Without immediate intervention, they feared the cubs wouldn't survive. The staff carefully removed the cubs from Sirona's enclosure, transferring them to a safe area where they could be monitored closely. They were placed in an incubator, but the staff knew this wasn't enough. They needed to find a solution fast, something that would not only save the cubs but also give them the chance to grow into strong, healthy tigers. But how could they provide the care they needed? Sirona's milk, essential for the cubs' survival, was unavailable. They couldn't risk relying on artificial substitutes alone. As they brainstormed, the answer came from an unexpected source. One of the reserve's veterinarians, who had been following Sirona's story closely, remembered a unique possibility: a German shepherd named Sandra. Sandra, who lived with a nearby family, had recently given birth to a litter of puppies. Sandra was healthy, strong, and had a nurturing instinct that might help save the cubs. The idea of using a dog's milk to feed tiger cubs was unusual, but not without merit. Veterinarians knew that the milk of many mammals, including dogs, could sometimes be used to nourish young animals of different species. But there was no guarantee that Sandra would accept the cubs. After all, she was a dog, and tigers were predators. Yet, the staff had no other choice. The situation was dire, and they had to act quickly. The family agreed to lend Sandra to the reserve, and within hours, The German Shepherd was brought to the enclosure where the cubs lay. The staff were nervous. Would Sandra accept them? How would the cubs react to her? Would the two species be able to connect? As Sandra entered the room, the cubs' tiny eyes locked on her. They were weak, their bodies trembling, but something about her presence seemed to soothe them. They instinctively reached out, desperate for any sign of warmth and comfort. Sandra, cautious at first, slowly approached the cubs. Her ears perked up, and her eyes softened. She sniffed them, a low growl escaping her throat. The staff held their breath, unsure of what would happen next. But then, to everyone's astonishment, Sandra gently lowered her head and nudged the cubs. The cubs, who had been so weak and frail just hours before, slowly began to move towards Sandra. They instinctively sought her warmth, and one by one, they latched onto her, sucking from her as though they had always been with her. The staff stood frozen in amazement. It was an unbelievable sight. Two tiger cubs, abandoned by their mother, now nursing from a dog. But it was happening. Sandra, with her motherly instincts, had accepted the cubs, and in that moment, the bond between them was forged. Over the next few weeks, the cubs began to thrive under Sandra's care. Their once frail bodies began to fill out, their fur grew thicker and shinier, and their energy returned. Every day, Sandra watched over them with a devotion that was almost maternal. She licked their fur clean, kept them warm at night, and made sure they were fed. She even began to play with them, encouraging them to strengthen their muscles as they grew. Despite the obvious differences between them, one was a dog, and the others were tigers. It was clear that something extraordinary was happening. But as the cubs grew stronger, so too did their instincts. They were no longer the fragile newborns that had clung to Sandra's side. They were becoming tigers, and with that came their growing strength and curiosity. But Sandra, ever the protector, continued to watch over them. She had saved their lives, and now, it seemed, she had found a new family to care for. Still, questions lingered in the air. How long would this unusual arrangement last? Would the cubs eventually outgrow Sandra's care? And what would happen when they were ready to face the wild world outside of the reserve? Would their bond remain, or would nature take its course, pulling them apart? The answers to these questions lay ahead, and no one could predict what would happen next. The only thing that was certain was that this was a story of survival, love, and the unexpected connections that could change the course of a life. And for the two tiger cubs, Sandra had become more than just a mother. She had become their savior. Chapter 2. Unlikely Bonds. The days passed slowly, each one marking a significant change in the growth of the tiger cubs. Sandra, the German Shepherd, had become the cubs' steadfast protector and mother. What had started as a necessity to keep them alive had blossomed into something deeper. Despite the vast differences between the two species, something about their bond felt natural, almost as if they were meant to be together. Sandra's initial wariness had given way to an unshakable attachment to the two cubs. She would nuzzle them gently, her strong paws wrapping around them protectively as they slept. The cubs, for their part, seemed to have found comfort in her warmth and security. They now eagerly anticipated their daily feedings, their eyes gleaming with trust as they instinctively turned to Sandra for comfort. In those moments, the differences between a wild tiger and a domestic dog seemed non-existent. The staff at the reserve marveled at the unusual sight. They had seen animals of different species interact before, but nothing quite like this. The tiger cubs were thriving under Sandra's care, their bodies growing more robust each day. The male cub, whose cries had once been weak, was now the more energetic of the two. He bounded around, his muscles developing quickly. The female cub, while smaller and more delicate, was catching up fast. Her once fragile frame had filled out, and her movements became more assured with each passing day. As the cubs grew stronger, Sandra's protective instincts deepened. She was always close by, watching over them with a vigilant eye. It was as if she had adopted the cubs as her own, her nurturing instincts fully engaged. Each day, Sandra would spend hours with the cubs, keeping them clean, feeding them, and even playing with them. When the cubs began to develop their strength and curiosity, she took it upon herself to teach them how to play in a safe and controlled manner. Despite being predators, the cubs were still babies, and Sandra's patience never wavered. However, as the cubs grew, so did the challenges that arose. Their developing instincts, particularly the cubs' playful roughhousing, started to test the boundaries of their unusual family. The staff watched with trepidation as the cubs began to exhibit behaviors that were typical of wild animals: climbing, pouncing, and using their sharp claws and teeth. Sandra, despite her affectionate nature, could only tolerate so much rough play before her instinct to protect herself kicked in. It became clear that the time was coming when the cubs would need to transition from the comfort and safety of Sandra's care to the more demanding life of the wild. But for now, Sandra and the cubs remained inseparable. As the weeks wore on, the cubs' development was nothing short of remarkable. They grew taller, their coats becoming thick and shiny, their eyes gleaming with the untamed spark of their tiger heritage. The staff began to worry about the moment when Sandra's role as their mother would no longer be enough. Would the cubs ever be able to fully integrate into the world of other tigers? Could they survive without the care of their surrogate mother? Despite these concerns, Sandra continued to be the cubs' steady companion, and the staff clung to the hope that this extraordinary bond would be enough to ensure the cubs' survival. But the questions kept growing. Would the cubs' instincts pull them away from Sandra once they reached maturity? Would they understand that she was not a tiger and eventually distance themselves from her? The uncertainty surrounding their future loomed large. But for now, the cubs were still young, still learning, and still very much in need of Sandra's care. The bond between them, though unusual, had become a testament to the power of love and instinct. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned a deep shade of purple, the staff gathered to observe the cubs. Sandra was lying on the ground, her head resting on her paws as the cubs napped nearby. The sight was peaceful, serene even, but there was an underlying tension in the air. The cubs had begun to grow rapidly, and soon, their playful roughhousing would become too much for Sandra to handle. The staff couldn't help but wonder if the time to separate them was approaching. In the weeks to come, the cubs would begin to venture farther from their surrogate mother, testing their boundaries as they explored the world around them. Sandra, as always, would be close by, her watchful eyes never straying far from the cubs. But the time for transition was drawing near, and the staff knew that this peaceful coexistence could not last forever. As the cubs grew, so did the complexity of their relationship with Sandra. The tiger cubs, now strong and agile, were learning to take care of themselves, but their bond with their surrogate mother remained as strong as ever. They would often find themselves returning to her, nuzzling her for comfort, just as they had when they were helpless babies. But with each passing day, the question of whether or not they would ever be able to live without Sandra became more pressing. Would the cubs be able to survive in the wild, or would their reliance on Sandra prevent them from fully embracing their tiger instincts? The answer was unclear, but the bond between Sandra and the cubs remained undeniable. No matter what happened next, the love and care Sandra had shown to her adopted cubs would remain a testament to the unlikeliest of family dynamics. And so, as the cubs grew stronger, and the staff of the White Tiger Reserve continued to monitor their development, they couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. The cubs were becoming more and more like their wild ancestors with each passing day, but they were still so young, still so dependent on Sandra's care. The time for their independence would come soon, but would it come too soon? Could they survive on their own? Or would the love of a mother, no matter her species, be enough to guide them through the difficult journey ahead? The answers to these questions would unfold in time. For now, all anyone could do was watch as the cubs grew into the tigers they were meant to be, with Sandra by their side, her heart full of love for the cubs she had saved, and they for her. But as they ventured further into the unknown, the question lingered. How much longer could they stay a family? Chapter 3: The Shift. The inevitable shift in the cubs' development came sooner than anyone expected. The staff had anticipated that the time would eventually come when the cubs would begin to rely less on Sandra and more on their own instincts. However, when it actually happened, It felt as if the entire world had shifted beneath them. It started subtly, with the cubs beginning to venture farther from their surrogate mother. At first, it was just a few steps away as they explored the perimeter of their enclosure, testing their boundaries. Sandra followed closely, keeping a watchful eye, but she allowed them the freedom to explore. It was a sign of their growing independence, a moment that made the staff members hopeful for the cubs' future. But then, one day, the cubs were gone. It was early in the morning, and the staff had been distracted by other duties. When they returned to the enclosure, they found it eerily quiet. No playful growls, no little tiger paws padding around. For a moment, panic set in. Had the cubs gotten out? Was something wrong? The staff quickly mobilized, searching the grounds, calling their names. It wasn't until one of the caretakers heard a faint rustling sound from behind the trees that they found them. The two cubs, now much larger and more agile, were crouched low in the underbrush, staring at the world beyond their enclosure. They were no longer the helpless babies who had once depended entirely on Sandra for survival. They had become wild. Sandra appeared moments later, her tail low, her ears flat against her head as she trotted up to the cubs. She barked softly, her usual calm demeanor replaced by a nervous energy. The cubs, however, didn't seem to acknowledge her presence. They were focused on something else, something that had captivated their attention and stirred their instincts. The wild. The call of something greater than their surrogate mother. For the first time since their arrival at the reserve, Sandra felt a deep sense of unease. The cubs were no longer her babies. They were becoming tigers, wild and untamable. As much as she loved them, Sandra could feel the gap widening between them. The staff watched quietly, a mixture of awe and concern on their faces. The cubs' instincts were awakening faster than they had anticipated. The transition from being entirely dependent on Sandra to exploring the world around them had happened almost overnight. It was both beautiful and heartbreaking. The male cub, who had always been the more adventurous one, took the lead. His eyes gleamed with curiosity as he padded confidently toward the boundary of the enclosure, his tail held high in the air. The female cub followed closely behind, her gaze fixed on the male as if to draw strength from his actions. They both paused at the edge of the enclosure, their ears flicking as they listened to the sounds of the outside world, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the distant calls of birds, the shifting of the earth beneath their paws. The wild was calling them, and they could no longer ignore it. Sandra remained standing behind them, her body stiff, her eyes wide with concern. The cubs turned back to her briefly, as if seeking reassurance. But when they saw her watchful eyes, they turned away. It was clear now they no longer needed her in the same way. The male cub made the first move, taking a tentative step outside the boundary of the enclosure. The female cub followed, her paws brushing the earth as she crossed the threshold. For a moment, the two cubs paused in the wild expanse that lay beyond their familiar territory. The open space stretched before them, and they stood there, taking it all in. Sandra's heart ached as she watched them go. She wanted to follow, to nudge them back into the safety of the reserve where they belonged. But something inside her knew that this moment had been coming for a long time. They were no longer her babies. They were tigers. The staff knew this moment was inevitable, but it didn't make it any easier. The bond between Sandra and the cubs had been something extraordinary, but the wild had a pull that no one, no matter how strong the love, could deny. And so, there they were. The cubs, finally free, standing on the precipice of their future. The staff remained silent, watching them from a distance, unsure of what would happen next. The male cub let out a low growl, his eyes scanning the horizon. The female cub sat down beside him, her gaze fixed on the vast unknown. Then, with one final glance back at Sandra, the cubs disappeared into the brush. Sandra stayed where she was, her body trembling slightly as she watched them go. She didn't chase after them, didn't bark in an attempt to bring them back. She knew they were ready for the next step. But that didn't stop the aching in her heart. The staff, too, felt the weight of the moment. They had known this day would come, but they hadn't expected it to be so final, so raw. They weren't sure what to feel. Pride in the cubs' survival instincts, or sorrow for the loss of a bond that had seemed unbreakable. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the reserve, the staff returned to their duties. But their minds were heavy with the knowledge that something had changed forever. The cubs were no longer under their protection, no longer a part of their carefully controlled world. They were out there, somewhere in the wild, ready to face whatever lay ahead. And Sandra, now alone, stood at the edge of the enclosure, her gaze lingering on the spot where the cubs had last been. Her heart ached with a mix of emotions: love, pride, and a sense of loss. She had raised them, nurtured them, and loved them as her own. But now they were gone. She turned away slowly, her tail low, and began walking back to her home. The staff watched her go, knowing that the journey ahead for Sandra would be one of adjustment. But for now, all they could do was wait and hope for the best. Would the cubs survive in the wild? Or would their reliance on Sandra's care leave them vulnerable? Would Sandra ever come to terms with their departure? Or would the memory of the cubs continue to haunt her? The answers remained unclear. For now, the only certainty was that the cubs had taken their first steps into the unknown, and their future, like the wild itself, was unpredictable and full of unanswered questions. Chapter 4. The Call of the Wild. Days passed after the cubs left their surrogate mother, Sandra. The staff at the reserve continued their work, but there was a subtle unease that lingered in the air. It was as if everything had changed overnight. The cubs had taken their first steps into the wild, and now they were part of a world they had never known. Sandra's routine became quieter, more solitary. She would still walk to the edge of the enclosure each day, stand there for a long while, and scan the horizon with a look of longing in her eyes. It wasn't that she was looking for the cubs specifically, but there was an unspoken bond between them, a connection that neither time nor distance could erase. Sandra had been the one to raise them, to teach them the ways of survival, even though they had always known they were destined for something greater than the safety of the reserve. But life at the reserve continued as it always did. The staff tended to the animals, cared for the needs of the creatures under their protection, and ensured that everything ran smoothly. Yet, every so often, they would glance over at Sandra, who seemed to be waiting for something. A return, perhaps, a sign. What they didn't know was that, beyond the walls of the reserve, the cubs were beginning to carve out their place in the world. The wild was harsh, and despite the training and the nourishment they had received, nothing could truly prepare them for what lay beyond the safety of the reserve's boundaries. The male cub, now named Tiberius, was the first to show signs of adapting to the wild. His instincts, sharp and alert, kicked in almost immediately. He quickly learned to track prey, his movements fluid and sure, like a shadow in the grass. He had been born in captivity, but the wild coursed through his veins, and he embraced it fully. He would often venture farther from his sister, seeking the thrill of the chase, testing the limits of his newfound freedom. The female cub, who was now known as Serafina, was slower to adapt. Her smaller frame and quieter nature made her more cautious. She would often stay close to the safety of the trees, watching her brother's exploits with a mix of awe and uncertainty. She still felt the pull of the reserve, the comforting presence of Sandra's warmth, and the protection that the familiar surroundings had offered. But the pull of the wild was undeniable. Both cubs were changing, growing stronger by the day. Tiberius had already begun to develop the deep, throaty growl that would one day be a fearsome roar. Serafina, too, was becoming more agile and alert. She had begun to observe her surroundings more closely, learning how to move in silence, how to listen to the subtle shifts in the air that could signal danger or opportunity. It was a moment of realization that they were no longer the helpless cubs that had relied on Sandra for survival. They were tigers, wild, untamed, and free. But that freedom came with risks. One day, as the cubs explored the fringes of the reserve's boundaries, they encountered a group of wild animals. A pack of hyenas, drawn by the scent of the cubs' presence, began to circle them. The cubs froze, their muscles tensing as the hyenas stalked closer. Tiberius's instincts kicked in, and he growled, trying to ward off the approaching predators. Serafina, however, felt the weight of fear settle in her chest. She had never faced anything like this before. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The hyenas were bold, sensing the cub's vulnerability, and they moved in closer, their eyes gleaming with hunger. Tiberius, with his newfound strength, was ready to defend, but Serafina hesitated. Her instincts were still developing, and she wasn't sure she could survive an encounter like this. Just as the hyenas made their move, something unexpected happened. A loud, deafening bark echoed through the clearing. It was a sound that immediately sent the hyenas into retreat, their cowardly nature taking over. The pack scattered, disappearing into the brush as quickly as they had appeared. Serafina's heart pounded as she turned to see the source of the sound. Her eyes widened with recognition. It was Sandra. The German shepherd appeared at the edge of the clearing, her fur matted with dust, her eyes wild with concern. She had been tracking the cubs for days, a mother's instinct driving her to check on them. And now, in this moment, Sandra had arrived just in time. Tiberius, who had been ready to confront the hyenas, softened when he saw her. His body relaxed as he approached the dog, nuzzling her with affection. Serafina, too, took a hesitant step forward, her eyes brimming with surprise. Sandra didn't bark again. She simply stood there, her presence strong and comforting, like an anchor in the storm of the wild. The cubs, although no longer dependent on her in the same way, found solace in her presence. There was a bond between them that the wild could not sever. Sandra had raised them, cared for them, and though they were growing more independent by the day, her love for them remained unyielding. The moment was brief, but it was enough. Sandra's visit had reminded the cubs of their past, of the safety they had once known, and of the love that had kept them alive. But the world around them was different now. They were no longer cubs. They were tigers, and they had a destiny to fulfill. Sandra lingered for a few more moments before turning and disappearing into the trees. The cubs watched her go, feeling a mix of emotions they couldn't quite understand. They had been raised by her, but they were no longer hers to protect. The wild was calling them, and the time had come for them to answer. The question that lingered in the air, unanswered, was simple. Would the bond between Sandra and the cubs remain, or would the wild, with its dangers and uncertainties, claim them entirely? As the cubs watched Sandra disappear into the forest, they couldn't help but wonder if they would ever see her again. Would she return to their lives, or had she, too, become a part of the distant past? Only time would tell. Chapter 5. A Mother's Touch. Weeks passed, and the world continued its quiet transformation. Tiberius and Serafina had begun to settle into their new lives in the wild. Though they were still young, their bodies were growing stronger with every passing day. They had learned to hunt, to stalk their prey in the shadows, and to communicate with each other in ways that only they understood. Their bond remained unbreakable, despite the differences in their personalities. Tiberius, the more fearless of the two, had developed an unyielding confidence. He had mastered the art of blending into the environment, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. His golden eyes gleamed with an untamed hunger, and his muscles rippled with each graceful movement. Serafina, on the other hand, remained more cautious, her quieter nature sometimes putting her at odds with her brother's impulsive behavior. Yet, despite their differences, the siblings complemented each other perfectly. Still, there was something that neither of them could ignore, an emptiness that lingered deep inside them. It wasn't that they were unhappy, but there was a lingering void that they couldn't quite explain. It wasn't the kind of emptiness that hunger could fill, or the kind that solitude could soothe. It was the kind of emptiness that came from a need that had never been completely met. The wild had a way of filling that void, at least for a time. But sometimes the call of the past would resurface. It would remind them of the warmth they had once felt in Sandra's presence, the safety of her steady, unwavering love. It had been weeks since the day Sandra had come to their rescue. After the hyena encounter, the cubs had felt both a sense of gratitude and confusion. Sandra had been there, just when they needed her most, yet they had long since outgrown their need for her milk and nurturing touch. They had moved past that stage in their lives. or so they thought. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape, Serafina wandered to the edge of the dense thicket where they had first encountered Sandra. She had done this often in recent days, almost as if she were hoping to find the German shepherd again. But each time she ventured into the same area, the silence greeted her. There was no bark, no wagging tail, only the rustle of the wind through the trees and the chirping of crickets. Tiberius had not noticed his sister's absence at first. He had been preoccupied with a recent hunt, testing his growing prowess in the wild. But as he made his way back to the den, his sharp eyes noticed Serafina's tracks leading into the underbrush. Something about the way she moved caught his attention, and a sense of worry stirred within him. With a deep growl, he followed her trail, his body low to the ground as he stalked silently through the forest. He found her sitting near the edge of the thicket, staring off into the distance with an expression he had never seen before. Her eyes were wide with longing, a mix of emotions that Tiberius didn't quite understand. There was something raw in her gaze, something he had never witnessed in the wild before. It was as if she were searching for something that couldn't be found among the trees and rocks. "Serafina," Tiberius said, his voice soft but concerned. "What are you doing here?" Serafina turned to look at her brother, her expression unchanged. I was hoping she would come back." Tiberius blinked, confused. "Who?" "The dog." "Sandra," Serafina whispered, as if saying the name aloud would make it real again. Tiberius felt a pang in his chest. Sandra. He hadn't thought about her in weeks. He had accepted that the wild was their home now, and that it was time to leave the past behind. But as Serafina spoke, something in him shifted. He had never realized how much he missed her too. The comforting warmth of her presence, the way she had gently licked their fur and curled up beside them at night. But that was a time that had passed, and the wild was calling them now. "I know, Serafina," Tiberius said gently, "but we can't keep waiting for her. We have to be strong on our own." Serafina nodded but said nothing more. She stood up and turned toward the deep forest, her head held high. Tiberius followed her, but his mind was far away, lost in a whirl of conflicting thoughts. He had never seen Serafina like this, vulnerable, yearning for something beyond the wild. That night, as they settled into their den, Tiberius couldn't shake the image of Sandra from his mind. The memory of her standing protectively over them, the way she had watched over them with a quiet strength, seemed to linger in the shadows of his thoughts. He knew they had outgrown the need for a mother like her, but still, there was something undeniable about the bond they shared. Little did they know, in the darkness of the forest beyond the thicket, Sandra was watching them. Her heart had never stopped aching for the cubs, and though she had returned to her own life, she knew she would never forget them. She could feel the pull of their spirits, a connection that transcended the boundaries of species. The love between them had been forged in the most unlikely of circumstances, and it was a love that would never fade. As Sandra lay in the quiet of the night, she knew something deep within her heart. Her bond with the cubs was far from over. She had raised them, nurtured them, and in her heart, they were always her children. And someday, perhaps sooner than she expected, she would see them again. The question, though, was what would happen when they did meet again. Would they remember her? Would the bond they had once shared still be as strong as it had been before? The forest held its breath, as if waiting for the answer to come. And somewhere deep in the night, a soft, familiar bark echoed through the trees. Chapter 6. The Reunion. It had been years since the cubs had left the safety of Sandra's warm embrace, and now, as the sun began to set on the horizon, a strange tension hung in the air. The wild had shaped Tiberius and Serafina into powerful, independent beings, stronger than they had been as helpless cubs in need of a mother's care. But the bond that had once tied them to Sandra remained unbroken, despite the passing time. It was early evening, the forest wrapped in the golden hues of dusk, when Tiberius and Serafina found themselves at the edge of the thicket once more. They had been wandering the territory as they often did, when some feeling, had drawn them back. The air was different today, heavier, almost expectant. The moment was fragile, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for what was to come. Serafina paused and sniffed the air, her nostrils flaring as she caught an unfamiliar scent. Tiberius stopped beside her, his sharp eyes scanning the shadows of the trees, but he couldn't see anything. Still, the scent was unmistakable, faint but familiar. It was Sandra. The realization hit him like a wave, and his heart skipped a beat. Could it really be her? After all these years, was it possible that their paths would cross again? Without a word, Serafina began to move forward, her body tense with anticipation. Tiberius followed close behind, his instincts alert, his senses heightened. They weaved through the thick brush, heading toward the clearing where they had first encountered Sandra. It was a place they had returned to many times, though it had always been empty. But now it felt different. The clearing was bathed in the fading light of the setting sun, the trees casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly across the earth. And there, standing at the edge of the clearing, was Sandra. Her fur was graying at the edges, her once energetic gait slowed by the passage of time. But there was no mistaking the bond she shared with the cubs. Her golden eyes glistened with recognition as they locked onto Tiberius and Serafina, her tail swishing slightly as she stood still, as if uncertain of how to approach them. For a moment, there was silence, an uncomfortable stillness that stretched between the past and the present. Tiberius could feel the weight of the years that had passed, the distance they had traveled in their lives since they had last seen her. But despite everything, despite the wilds and the life they had built for themselves, a deep, primal connection stirred within him. Serafina was the first to break the silence. She stepped forward, her ears pricked, her body tense with cautious curiosity. "Sandra, is it really you?" The dog's ears twitched at the sound of Serafina's voice, and she let out a soft whimper, almost as if she were answering. Her eyes were full of emotion, recognition and longing flashing in their depths. She took a tentative step toward them, her body low to the ground, her movements hesitant. The wild was not a place for such emotions, and yet here it was, this unexpected reunion between a mother and her children, between two beings from different worlds who had once shared a bond that neither time nor distance could erase. Tiberius stepped forward, his powerful body moving gracefully through the tall grass. His heart was pounding in his chest, but he held himself in check. He had learned not to act impulsively, not to rush into anything without understanding it first. And yet, a part of him longed for this moment. To see Sandra again, to feel her warmth and affection once more, to know that she hadn't forgotten them. Sandra raised her head, her eyes softening as she looked at them both. The years had clearly taken their toll, but there was no mistaking the deep love that emanated from her. Slowly, cautiously, she closed the distance between them, her steps measured but full of intent. Serafina's eyes glistened with emotion as she stepped forward, her body trembling slightly. "You never left us, did you?" Sandra's response was silent but powerful. She nuzzled Serafina's face gently with her nose, her warm breath ruffling the cub's fur. Serafina closed her eyes, leaning into the familiar touch. For a moment, the wildness of the world around them faded away, leaving only the bond between them, unbroken, unyielding, timeless. Tiberius watched in quiet awe as the reunion unfolded before him. He hadn't realized just how much he had missed this connection, this comfort. His heart swelled with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, something that felt like home. As Sandra turned to Tiberius, she gave him the same gentle nudge, her eyes filled with a love that transcended words. Tiberius hesitated, but only for a moment. Then, without thinking, he allowed himself to feel the tenderness of the reunion. He pressed his head against Sandra's, feeling the warmth of her body, the familiar scent of her fur. It was a feeling he had never quite been able to shake, even after all this time. But just as quickly as the moment had arrived, a shift in the air made Tiberius' instincts flare. A distant growl echoed from somewhere deeper in the forest, low and threatening. It was followed by another, then another. The peace of the moment shattered. Tiberius' muscles tensed, and his ears flicked toward the source of the sound. Something was coming. Something dangerous. Sandra's head snapped up, her body going rigid. She glanced at the cubs, then back at the trees. Her protective instincts kicked in, and she growled low in her throat, stepping closer to Serafina and Tiberius. The growls grew louder, closer. Tiberius felt a surge of adrenaline. His eyes narrowed, scanning the shadows. But it was Sandra who moved first, stepping forward with a quiet strength that left no room for hesitation. "Stay close," she said, her voice low and firm. But what would happen next? Would the trio be able to defend themselves against the threat? And would this moment of reunion lead to a new chapter in their lives? Or would it end as quickly as it had begun? The forest seemed to hold its breath as the growls drew nearer. Chapter 7. The Unseen Threat. The tension in the air was thick, a palpable sense of foreboding pressing down on the small clearing. Tiberius and Serafina, their instincts honed by years in the wild, were on high alert, their muscles coiled in readiness. But even they could not ignore the presence that lingered just beyond the trees, the growing intensity of the growls echoing through the forest like a warning. Sandra stood firm, her body low, her hackles raised in response to the sound. Her golden eyes, once full of warmth and affection, now glinted with a fierce protectiveness. She wasn't just a mother to the cubs. She was a guardian, a warrior in her own right, and she would not let anything threaten the family she had once raised. The growls were getting closer, and Tiberius felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his chest. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this was different. The air seemed to vibrate with a sense of dread. The forest was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a battleground. Serafina, ever the more cautious of the two, looked at Tiberius with wide eyes. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sounds of the approaching threat. She was more accustomed to dealing with prey, with the smaller creatures of the wild. This was something far more dangerous, something that didn't belong here. Tiberius didn't answer immediately. He was listening, trying to make sense of the sounds, trying to place them. There was something off about the growls, something familiar, yet wrong. It wasn't the usual call of a predator or the territorial warning of a rival. It was deeper, more sinister. "Stay behind me," Tiberius said, his voice low but commanding. His protective instincts surged, and he felt a surge of adrenaline course through him. He wasn't just protecting himself or Serafina now. He was protecting Sandra, the one who had given them life when no one else had. Sandra didn't need to be told twice. She took a step forward, her body positioned between the cubs and the direction of the growls. Her stance was unwavering, and for a moment, Tiberius saw the dog he had known in her. The same dog that had once nursed them with tenderness, that had protected them when they were helpless cubs. But there was something else in her now, something harder, sharper. She had been shaped by the wild just as they had. And then, from the edge of the forest, the source of the growls emerged. Tiberius' heart skipped a beat as the creature stepped into the clearing. It was massive, its fur matted with dirt and blood, its eyes glowing with an unnatural ferocity. A wild boar, its tusks gleaming dangerously in the fading light, stomped into the open space, its snout sniffing the air as it searched for the scent of its prey. Tiberius and Serafina instinctively stepped back, their muscles tensed for the attack. They knew the boar was dangerous. It was a formidable opponent, strong and unpredictable. But it was not what had them most on edge. There was something else in the air, a presence that was even more menacing than the boar itself. The boar snorted loudly, its eyes locking onto the group in the clearing. But before it could charge, a low, guttural growl rumbled from the trees behind it. From the shadows, another figure emerged. Tiberius' blood ran cold. It was a creature unlike any he had ever seen. A massive wolf, its fur black as night and its eyes burning with an unnatural hunger. The wolf's body was sleek and muscular, its movements fluid and silent as it stalked toward the group. But what sent a shiver down Tiberius' spine was the look in its eyes. It was not a wild animal driven by instinct, it was something more, something unnatural. "Wolves don't move like that," Tiberius whispered, his voice barely audible. His hackles rose in recognition. "That's no ordinary wolf." Sandra growled low, her body tensing as she took a step back, positioning herself between the cubs and the growing threat. The wolf's eyes flicked over to her, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. The wolf's gaze was predatory, calculating. It was as if it understood what Sandra was, who she was. A protector, a mother, and it didn't like the competition. Tiberius' heart pounded in his chest as he watched the wolf circle, its movements slow and deliberate. The boar, oblivious to the presence of the wolf, continued to snort and paw the ground, but Tiberius knew it was only a matter of time before chaos broke loose. "I'll handle the boar," Tiberius said, his voice sharp and commanding. He didn't wait for a response. His body moved instinctively, his instincts honed by years of survival in the wild. He darted toward the boar, his powerful legs carrying him with speed and agility. The boar charged, tusks gleaming in the dying light, but Tiberius was faster. With a powerful leap, he lunged at the boar's side, sinking his claws into its tough hide. The boar squealed in pain, twisting to throw Tiberius off, but the tiger held fast, his strength overwhelming the beast. The struggle was fierce, but Tiberius kept his grip, biting down on the boar's neck until it stilled beneath him. But as the boar fell, Tiberius felt a shift in the air. The wolf was no longer focused on them. It had turned its attention to Sandra and Serafina. The wolf's growl reverberated through the clearing, low and menacing. It stalked forward, its eyes locked onto Sandra, who stood her ground, her body bristling with tension. She had faced many dangers in her life, but this was different. This was a challenge she hadn't been prepared for. Sandra wasn't backing down. She couldn't. Serafina stood beside her, her body trembling with fear but her resolve unwavering. She had learned from the best. She would fight for this family no matter the cost. The wolf paused, its eyes flicking between Sandra and Serafina. It was as if it was weighing its options, sizing them up. It growled again, but there was something strange in the sound, almost like a warning. What was it waiting for? And what would happen next? Would the wolf attack? Or was it something else? Would the bond between mother and children be enough to protect them? The tension in the air was unbearable as Sandra and Serafina braced themselves for whatever was to come. The world held its breath. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the wolf turned and vanished back into the shadows of the forest. Sandra let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her body relaxing just slightly. But the danger wasn't over. Not yet. Tiberius approached cautiously, his eyes scanning the shadows where the wolf had disappeared. The wild was unpredictable, and they could never let their guard down completely. But for now they had survived. And they had each other. What was the wolf's true intention? Was it a sign of something greater looming over them, or just a strange encounter in the wild? And as the sun finally dipped below the horizon, the question lingered. What would happen next? Chapter 8. The Hidden Bond. The sun had long set, casting the world into a deep, shadowed quiet. The clearing was still but not peaceful. The lingering tension from the wolf's sudden appearance had yet to dissipate, hanging over them like a storm cloud on the horizon. Tiberius sat with his back against a large tree, his muscles tense and eyes scanning the darkness, alert to any sounds that might signal another attack. Serafina, sitting close to him, had yet to speak, her gaze drifting toward the forest where the wolf had disappeared. She was trying to make sense of the encounter, trying to understand what had just happened. Sandra, ever the guardian, had not moved from her spot beside the cubs. Her eyes, though weary, never strayed far from the horizon. The cubs, now safely nestled against her warm body, were sound asleep, oblivious to the danger they had narrowly escaped. The night seemed so peaceful for them, the world outside of their little nest full of silent stars and the sounds of distant creatures. But for Sandra, Tiberius, and Serafina, the night was a reminder of the ever-present dangers they faced. Tiberius' mind was racing. The wolf had left as suddenly as it had come, but the memory of its unsettling growl remained etched in his mind. It wasn't just a random predator, that much was clear. It had been far too calculating, too focused. Something about it had felt wrong, almost as if it had a purpose in mind. "We need to move," Tiberius said, breaking the silence, his voice low and grim. He knew they couldn't linger in one place for too long. The wolf's behavior was unnatural, and he had no idea if it would return with a stronger force. He looked at Sandra, then at Serafina. "We can't afford to be caught off guard." Serafina nodded, though doubt clouded her expression. "Where will we go? There's no guarantee we'll be safer anywhere else." Tiberius clenched his jaw. She was right. They couldn't run forever, and they couldn't live in constant fear of the unknown. But they couldn't just ignore the possibility of greater danger either. He turned to look at Sandra, whose eyes were locked on the horizon. "What do you think?" he asked, his voice soft. It was rare for him to look to Sandra for guidance on matters like this, but in the silence of the night, he felt an unspoken bond between them, a connection that went beyond words. Sandra's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. She glanced back at the cubs, then at the darkness surrounding them. After a long pause, she gave a slow, deliberate nod. She had her own instincts, ones that had guided her through years of surviving in the wild. She didn't say a word, but her actions spoke volumes. Without hesitation, she rose to her feet, signaling that she was ready to move. Tiberius felt a surge of respect for her. She had taken on the role of mother, protector, and guide all at once, and she did it without question, without doubt. Her strength was unwavering, and in that moment, Tiberius felt a deep sense of gratitude for the bond they had formed over the years. "Let's go," Tiberius said, his voice steady. "We'll find a safer place." They moved quietly through the woods, the darkness swallowing them whole. Tiberius, with Sandra at the lead and Serafina close behind, kept his senses sharp, listening for any signs of movement in the trees. The eerie silence was almost worse than the growls of the wolf. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Sandra's movements were calculated, precise. She led them toward a dense thicket, a place where they could hide and rest for the night. Her instincts had never steered them wrong, and Tiberius trusted her judgment implicitly. As they made their way through the underbrush, Tiberius caught sight of the cubs. Their small forms nestled against Sandra's side. They looked so peaceful, so innocent. He couldn't bear the thought of them being hurt, of anything happening to them. The night dragged on, and just as they were beginning to settle in the thicket, Tiberius heard something, an almost imperceptible rustle in the bushes. His heart raced, his muscles tensed. It was too quiet, too still. Sandra froze, her body becoming taut with anticipation. Her eyes narrowed, her ears flicking back in alertness. The air around them seemed to vibrate with the presence of something. Someone, close by. It wasn't the wolf, but the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. Something was out there, and it wasn't giving them the luxury of peace. Tiberius crouched low, signaling to Serafina to do the same. The cubs stirred slightly, sensing the change in the atmosphere, but they didn't wake. Sandra, however, remained perfectly still, her gaze locked on the shadows ahead. What was it? Was it another predator? Or was it something far worse? The rustling grew louder, closer. And then, through the dense foliage, a figure appeared. It was a man. Tiberius' heart skipped a beat, a flash of disbelief crossing his mind. A man here in the middle of the wild? How had he gotten so close without them noticing? The man's eyes were wild, his face gaunt and hollow, as though he hadn't seen the light of day in months. His clothes were torn and ragged, and he had the unmistakable air of someone who had been living off the land for far too long. But what struck Tiberius the most was the look in the man's eyes. It was an intense, feverish gaze, as if he were searching for something or someone. He scanned the clearing, his eyes lingering on the cubs before moving to Sandra. For a long moment, the man stood there, as if considering them, as if deciding what to do next. Tiberius' heart raced, his instincts screaming at him to act, to protect the cubs, to fight. But there was something about this man that unsettled him. "What do you want?" Tiberius finally demanded, his voice a low growl. The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a cautious step forward, his eyes never leaving the group. His lips parted slightly as if about to speak, but then he faltered. And then, in a voice that seemed almost too calm for the wild, he spoke. "I'm looking for them," he said quietly. "I've been searching for the cubs." Tiberius' blood ran cold. Searching for the cubs? But why? And who was this man? The man took another step closer, his eyes still fixated on the cubs. Tiberius moved to block his path, his muscles coiled for action, but he held back. Something about this man felt off, like he wasn't just a simple wanderer lost in the woods. "What do you mean, searching for them?" Tiberius asked, his voice tight with suspicion. The man's lips curled into a small, strange smile. "I've been sent to find the cubs. They're more important than you know." The words hung in the air like a challenge, leaving Tiberius with more questions than answers. Who was this man? And what was it that made these cubs so important? As the man's presence loomed over them, the questions only deepened. What would happen next? The night was far from over, and the real danger was only just beginning. Chapter 9. The Truth Behind the Stranger. The air was thick with uncertainty as Tiberius stood between the man and the cubs, his body rigid with tension. The strange figure, gaunt and disheveled, seemed to sense the rising hostility, but his gaze remained locked on the cubs with an intensity that unnerved Tiberius. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, an oppressive, heavy silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Sandra stood still beside the cubs, her body tense, her instincts screaming that something was wrong. She could feel the subtle vibrations in the air, the strange pull of danger that seemed to emanate from the man. And yet there was something more, a peculiar feeling almost like a pull, as if he were familiar in some way that defied logic. Tiberius took a cautious step forward, narrowing the gap between them. His hand instinctively hovered over the hilt of the knife at his waist, ready to defend his family. "Who are you?" Tiberius demanded, his voice sharper now, more insistent. "What do you want with the cubs?" The man's eyes flickered to Tiberius for just a moment before returning to the cubs, his lips curling into a smile that seemed devoid of warmth. His smile sent a shiver down Tiberius's spine. There was something unhinged about this man, a dissonance in the way he spoke and the look in his eyes. "I'm not here to harm them," the man said, his voice calm, but his words rang hollow, almost rehearsed. "I've been searching for them for a long time." Tiberius's brows furrowed. Searching? For what? The man didn't seem to be a threat, at least not in the way Tiberius had expected. His words seemed too deliberate, too careful. "You've been looking for them?" Tiberius's voice was low, filled with suspicion. "Why?" The man took a slow step forward, his movements calculated. He didn't seem frightened by Tiberius's aggressive posture, which only made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. "There's a prophecy," the man said, his voice dropping to a whisper, as though the very mention of the words might bring some unseen force crashing down upon them. "A prophecy about two cubs, destined for something greater. I've been sent to find them, to protect them." Tiberius's mind raced. Prophecy? He had heard of such things in stories, tales of ancient secrets and destiny, but he hadn't believed in them. Until now. The man's cryptic words stirred something deep inside him, a feeling he couldn't ignore. "What do you mean, destined for something greater?" Tiberius asked, his voice tight. He felt a chill run through him, and his protective instincts flared. The man's eyes gleamed, and he stepped even closer, his voice lowering further. "They are not just ordinary cubs. They are part of something much larger, a force that has been hidden for generations." Tiberius glanced at the cubs, who were nestled together, oblivious to the tension that surrounded them. They were so young, so innocent. How could they be part of something so enormous? Sandra, sensing the rising danger, finally moved forward, placing herself firmly between Tiberius and the stranger. Her growl was low, a warning. The man didn't flinch, but his eyes softened, as if he recognized the gesture for what it was. You've been searching for these cubs for a long time, Tiberius repeated, his suspicion mounting. Who sent you? And why? The man hesitated, a flicker of something dark passing across his face. For a split second, it seemed as though he was considering whether or not to tell the truth. There are others, the man finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Others who want the cubs for themselves. They will stop at nothing to get them. They need to be protected, Tiberius. I've been sent to make sure they are. The mention of his name made Tiberius's stomach drop. How did this man know his name? Had he been watching them? And who were these others he spoke of? The weight of the situation pressed down on him, and his thoughts began to spiral. Who are these people? What do they want with them? Tiberius asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The man glanced over his shoulder as though checking for something. Then he leaned in closer, his voice barely a whisper. The cubs are special. More special than you could imagine. They are the key to something ancient, something that has been buried for centuries. And there are those who believe that if they control the cubs, they will gain unimaginable power. Tiberius's heart raced. This was madness. He couldn't understand it, couldn't wrap his mind around the implications of what the man was saying. It didn't make sense. And yet, the conviction in the stranger's eyes suggested that he believed every word. Before Tiberius could respond, the man took another step back, his gaze flickering to the cubs once more. You must understand, he said, his voice quiet but urgent. The prophecy is real. The cubs have a destiny, and if they're allowed to grow freely, to reach their full potential, they will change the world. Tiberius's mind was racing, processing everything the man had said, but the more he thought about it, the more questions arose. What kind of destiny? What was the ancient force the man had mentioned? And why were the cubs so vital to it? Sandra's body was still tense, her muscles coiled and ready to strike at any moment. She wasn't sure if she could trust this man. No, she didn't trust him. She couldn't. Tiberius took a deep breath, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and fear. And what do you want from us? You want us to trust you? You want us to believe in this prophecy? The man gave a small, sad smile, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and urgency. I'm not asking you to believe in it. I'm just asking you to protect them. The others will come soon. You won't have much time. Tiberius's heart thundered in his chest. They had to leave. They had to get the cubs to safety immediately. But there was no way to know where they would be safe. No way to know who to trust. The man stepped back slowly, as if he could sense Tiberius's growing distrust. I will be watching, he said softly, his eyes glinting with something darker now. And when the time comes, you'll understand. He turned and melted into the shadows, disappearing as quietly as he had arrived. Tiberius stood motionless for a moment, still processing the encounter. Do you believe him? Serafina asked quietly, her voice trembling. Tiberius didn't know what to believe. One thing was certain, though, they were no longer safe. The threat had grown much larger, and it was closing in on them. As the night wore on, Tiberius couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. But the most unsettling part was that he had no idea what was coming next, or who could be trusted. The future, once so simple, was now a tangle of mysteries and dangers. And the cubs had become the key to it all. What did this prophecy really mean for them? What would they become? The questions lingered in the air, unanswered, as the darkness of the night pressed in on them. And in that silence, Tiberius couldn't help but wonder, what would happen when the prophecy finally came to pass? The story was far from over, and the next chapter was still unfolding. Chapter 10, The Coming Storm. The morning sun broke through the trees, casting a golden glow across the dense forest surrounding the sanctuary. But the warmth that touched the earth did little to soothe the growing sense of unease that had settled over Tiberius. As he looked out over the tranquil landscape, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting, something unseen and dangerous, lurking just beyond the horizon. Sandra stood beside him, her powerful form a silent reminder of the bond they shared, her alertness sharp as ever. The cubs, now much larger and stronger, played nearby, their laughter filling the air, a stark contrast to the tension that gripped Tiberius's chest. Despite their growing size, the cubs were still so innocent, unaware of the forces stirring around them. They didn't know about the prophecy, the dangers, or the man who had come with his cryptic words. Tiberius couldn't stop thinking about him, the stranger who had warned them, who had spoken of the prophecy with such conviction. The words repeated in his mind like an endless echo. Asterisk, they are the key to something ancient. If they're allowed to grow freely, they will change the world. Asterisk, what could that mean? How could two cubs, two creatures so young and helpless, hold the power to alter the course of history? It didn't make sense. It was absurd. Yet, there was something in the stranger's eyes that made Tiberius wonder if the impossible might actually be possible. The way the man had spoken, as if he carried the weight of a great secret, something that could shatter everything Tiberius knew. And the mention of others, the ones who wanted the cubs for themselves, those others were a threat. Tiberius could feel it in his bones. The idea that the cubs were somehow special had taken root in his mind. They weren't just ordinary animals, they were destined for something, and that destiny was a path he was reluctant to walk. But one thing was clear. Tiberius couldn't allow harm to come to them, no matter the cost. He turned to Sandra, his eyes meeting hers, and for a moment, they shared an unspoken understanding. They would protect the cubs no matter what. They were family now, but the question still lingered. Asterisk, who could they trust? Asterisk. As the days passed, Tiberius and Sandra worked tirelessly to fortify the sanctuary, reinforcing the boundaries and ensuring that the cubs would be safe. They didn't know who would come or when, but they could feel the storm brewing. Something was coming, something that would test them in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. And then, just as Tiberius had feared, the first sign of the approaching danger came on the 5th night after the stranger's visit. A shadow fell over the sanctuary, darkening the once peaceful landscape. Tiberius was jolted awake by a low growl from Sandra. His hand instinctively reached for his weapon, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. This wasn't a simple threat, it was something more. Sandra barked sharply, her body tense as she sniffed the air. Her ears pricked in the direction of the forest. Tiberius's heart raced as he stood and made his way to the cubs. The young tigers were sleeping soundly, oblivious to the danger creeping closer. He carefully shook them awake, his voice urgent but calm. "Get up," he whispered. "We need to move now." The cubs stirred, their eyes wide with confusion and fear. They had never seen Tiberius like this before, never seen him so tense. But they trusted him, and without question, they followed him as he ushered them toward the hidden shelter he had prepared in the heart of the sanctuary. Sandra stood guard at the entrance, her body a fierce silhouette in the dim light. She growled again, low and guttural, her senses heightened. She knew something was coming, and she wouldn't let it get close. Tiberius crouched down, looking the cubs in the eyes. "Stay here. No matter what happens, do not leave this place." The cubs nodded, their wide, innocent eyes filled with trust and fear. Tiberius's heart ached. He couldn't help but feel responsible for them. They weren't just animals, they were his family, and he couldn't let anything happen to them. Sandra's growl escalated, rising to a terrifying crescendo. The air around them grew thick with tension. Tiberius's grip tightened on his weapon as he slowly moved toward the trees, where the dark shapes were beginning to form. They were coming, whoever they were. Suddenly, a flash of movement broke through the trees, and Tiberius's breath caught in his throat. Figures emerged, figures cloaked in shadows, their faces hidden. The stranger had warned him. The others had arrived. Without hesitation, Tiberius raised his weapon and stood firm. Sandra barked again, this time more forcefully, and the figures froze. They were trying to assess their next move, calculating whether to confront them head-on or retreat into the darkness. But they weren't alone. Behind them, 2 other figures appeared, walking slowly out of the shadows. And this time, Tiberius's heart skipped a beat. He recognized them. The first was the man who had come to warn him, the one who spoke of the prophecy. And beside him stood someone else, someone he hadn't seen before, but whose presence sent a chill through his spine. "Stay back!" Tiberius shouted, his voice carrying across the clearing. He wasn't sure if the figures would listen, but he knew he had to try. The stranger who had come before nodded slowly, his eyes locked on Tiberius. "They've come for them, Tiberius. You don't understand what's at stake. You need to trust me." Tiberius's mind raced, but before he could respond, one of the figures behind the stranger moved forward, revealing his face. It was a man he had seen before. A man with a scar that ran across his cheek. A man who had once been a part of their world. And then, it hit him. The truth was even more twisted than he could have imagined. These people weren't just after the cubs. They had been watching them all along. They knew about the prophecy. They knew about the force that was growing inside the cubs. And they weren't the only ones. The storm was coming, but no one knew how it would end. Tiberius's pulse quickened as he realized the full scope of the danger. The cubs were the key, but to what, and who would be the ones to unlock their true power? As the tension between them grew, Tiberius knew that they were on the edge of something far bigger than anyone could have predicted. And the choices they made in the next moments could alter the course of their lives, and the lives of the cubs forever. What would happen next? Would Tiberius and Sandra be able to protect the cubs from the dark forces closing in on them? And what would the prophecy reveal about their true purpose? The answers were still hidden in the shadows, and soon the storm would break.